Our guest today is Aonghus Gordon, and Angus is the founder of Ruskin Mill Trust and has led the trust as the CEO for the last 40 years and is just handing it over to a colleague at the moment. And Angus has pioneered an extremely unique method of therapeutic education, which is inspired by Rudolf Steiner, John Ruskin, and also William Morris and their ideas on social renewal, healthy human development, and with a special focus on the importance of art, craft, and land work. So, Angus, I just want to welcome you to the podcast today.
So thank you very much, Mike.
Yeah, you're welcome. So maybe, well, Angus, we're actually just point out to the viewers, we're actually just across the road from each other, so I could probably see through your window almost from, but I'm not set up to record live at the moment, so here we are on Zoom. Anyway, I'd love to hear a little bit about your background, just for people to have a sense of who you are, maybe how you came into contact with Steiner's work. That's what we focus on here. But yeah, you could start wherever you like.
Okay, so I was born into a family who were based in Steiner's vision, and my father was a physicist, teacher. My mother was a story writer and teacher, and I had I think a culturally privileged education because I was brought up in Venice, and my father ran a school of art appreciation there, and braided the legacy of Venice into the development of consciousness. And he undertook tours, wrote books, and had a center of cultural development, really. And however, one of the interesting things in being brought up in Venice is that I learned to read architecture before I learned to read. So I could name different genres of architectural culture. And I think this is part of a gift that I was given. And so I'm visually aware of aesthetics, and I work in an aesthetical context. And some people ask me, so what are you? You trained as a potter? Yes. You're a teacher? Yes. But most of all, I'm probably an artist, but not the painter or the sculptor artist, but an artist of ecological, social, and kind of spiritual ideas born out of Ruskin and Steiner in particular. So why is Ruskin important? Well, he is, in my view, the Anglo-Saxon Goethe, and he was able to write and articulate a new way of seeing during the reign of Queen Victoria, and accompanied the critiquing of the Industrial Revolution from a young boy, actually, already at the age of 12. He told his father that he didn't think that Turner could properly draw, because when he compares the landscape that his father's taken him to, and he compares it to the Turner picture, they're different. And his father said, well, yes, because the artist has imagination, and you are looking at something with a very exacting eye. And he said, but this is what I see. So why couldn't Turner see what I see? And you remember, he's the age of 12. And in a way, Ruskin can be considered the first art critic. And I think that's quite a tribute. And so his capacity to see was searing and informed and exceedingly accurate. And actually, John Ruskin himself was quite an artist and an accomplished artist. But I would say the most remarkable thing he achieved from accessing Goethe's ideas was the ability to see morphologically. So in his book, The Stones of Venice, it really is a treatise on Goethe's phenomenology of how stones have origin in mountains and tectonic forces and transform and become jewels, and human beings collect them, these stones, and then make cities from them. And so he can take you through the whole story from the origin of stone right into the palatial palaces of the Grand Canal. And that journey is not just phantasmagorical, it is accurate and scientific. By the way, he did study geology. So Ruskin for me was a breath of fresh air, because I could read from an English text what Goethe was also trying to express. And so this marriage between Ruskin and Rudolf Steiner, obviously, Rudolf Steiner being the kind of student of Goethe initially, this relationship was important in myself being able to see maybe the world differently. Now, that was encouraged by my parents. I was then very fortunate. I went to Rudolf Steiner schools. They weren't entirely easy for me because, frankly, I played on the streets of Venice until I was 8. And as I said, I read architecture before I learned to read. And so the more academic side of school was not straightforward initially. But what did the Steiner school actually endow me with? I think if I go back and look at it, it was the ability to nurture a creative process without it being stalled or stunted or demonized, particularly. I was given the bandwidth to be able to be and to generate ideas. And very often, rather than writing an essay, I would paint a picture. And a bit like Ruskin, I learned to articulate the world I saw and understood through a pictorial imaging. Now, that was further extended and developed by my mother, who was a poet and story writer. And so when I left school, I did go and study ceramics. In fact, I studied Chinese ceramics, and I was interested in this Chinese idea that you can transcend material in such a way that light can penetrate it and it can become transparent. So I became very interested in Chinese porcelains. I became very interested in pigments, colors, metal oxides. And in a way, I tried to replicate precious stones through Chinese porcelain celadons. And then went on to do a teacher's training. That brought me into a bit of conflict with the school system as it was. And I had the great opportunity of working with some very tricky young lads, tall, big, highly active, verbally, well, what would you say? Verbally abusive, potentially, but not to myself. In fact, I had a very good relationship with them. And I recall taking them outdoors to undertake a sculpture, and to actually release their kind of kinetic energy. And this was a very successful project, but I'd made one error of not informing the head teacher, but only the head of department. And on returning back to the classroom, I was accused of disestablishing the authority of the school, and which I found a very strange accusation. But I was 23, slightly hurt, and my conclusion was that I'm unlikely to wish to work in that type of education. And I was then told by the head teacher that in my report back to the college, it would be unlikely that Aonghus Gordon would be able to work in normal education. So I had an interview with the head of the department. The head of the department never even discussed the issue. But at the, on my departure from the checking in with her, actually, she did say to me that she thought I'd be an excellent teacher. So that was the end of that. However, it is absolutely correct. I wasn't suited for regular education. I was suited to innovate, and I was interested in those young lads and lasses who actually can't tolerate the indoors. And under a bit more research and a bit more training I did, it became clear to me that I was interested in the concept of deschooling. How do you actually disestablish the school in such a way that actually you can find classrooms in nature? How can you find new forms of mathematics, literature, poetry, pigments, shaping things, connecting to the world in such a way that your identity could be seen and recognized by others. So this led me into some quite interesting educational thinkers, practitioners, and but nevertheless, having tested Steiner many times in this area, I always fell back into Steiner's absolute genius of his spiritual science in understanding human development, and particularly child development. And what stood out was his utter compassion and love for human beings to develop. And that's actually very, it's very, what's the word? It's very humbling. And so I did actually join the Anthroposophic Society quite young. But I also saw some problems with Steiner schools, and I also saw some problems with interpreting Steiner himself into the English language and into the English culture. And that concerned me more for Steiner than for anything else, really. Now, I'm not sure whether I've always done justice to Steiner, but I tried to vow to try and make what I do coming out of an English vernacular. And so I found myself in an interesting area of research called the genus loci. And this is essentially a Goethean methodology of discovering the signature of a place. And what became clear in this fourfold study of mineral, plant, animal, and human is that this fourfold picture, which you can find anywhere in the world, because we've touched just about everywhere in the world, this fourfold picture is also an inner constitutional element of the human being. So having seen this outside, I could also recognize through Steiner's human development this capacity of seeing fourfold inside: the constitution of the physical body, the life forces around the child or the young person, the ability of the soul to have an interior in which you can begin to experience the world and yourself and mediate and have a language for that. And then the amazing development of the sense of I, which has capacity to say no to the self. And this for me was transformative. And having seen the impact of human beings on landscape, I thought it would be only sensible to start working with this fourfold quality, which I can find in the world of nature and also in the world of the human being. And in a way, after many years of research, there was a handshake between that world outside and that world inside. And so practical skills, therapeutic education began to emerge. It wasn't called that in those early days, but I endeavored to try and find this a relationship. It's a form of deep ecology within a spiritual context of how do we transform ourselves, and can nature help that transformation within itself? So in spite of being and describing myself as a bit of an artist, I'm also a bit of a scientist. And I would say that this developed actually in the Steiner School as well, because I became very interested in chemistry, geography, geology, meteorology. So these earth sciences actually informed the lens by which I looked into the world, and how I then began to draw back curriculum and started to write up a methodology. And this methodology I submitted to a master's much later on, at around the age of 55 or so, and found myself going to universities to see whether they would be willing to put it into a master's program. And my first university that I took it to was the University of the West of England, and they rejected it as an educational method, which was really bizarre. So I said, well, what is it then? They said, oh, it's social science. And I said, I'm not sure, but I'm an educator. Social science, Mr. Gordon. By the way, if you want to go down the corridor and see the social science department there, I think they'd be interested to read it. I did, and they promptly said yes, they'd turn it into a master's. And we said then with Crossfields, I set up the master's, and staff started to study the method of Ruskin Mill Trust. Now, why is all this important? What happened is that a language developed. It was rigorous. We found lots of friends who thought in a similar way. So we found a community of thinkers and practitioners in different modes of education. The staff had opportunities to reflect on what they do. So they became action researchers. And in this action research, you actually have the most favored method of checking spiritual science. And we could extend that into collaborative action inquiry. And it didn't take long before I discovered, of course, that we do this in Steiner education anyway with the child and student study. So I then looked into the child and student study and realized that this is actually highly progressive. Not only did the community of the teachers come around and take a look on a compassionate and deeply empathetic level with regards to the child or the young person, but they were also able to do this sequential element of acknowledging the developmental process of a child, and with that information, cross-reference to the team sitting in the room looking at that young person, new insights could be developed, and new insights indeed emerged, and changes could be made to the relationship of the child and the student to the learning journey. So the introduction of the child and student study in Waldorf education is a work of genius. It takes place in the National Health Service on a certain level, with interdisciplinary teams working to look at a situation which is possibly complex in the health service. When I was gifted Sunfield Rudolf Steiner School, although it wasn't called that, but it was originally the first specialist Rudolf Steiner School in the UK, set up by Irte Wegman, that activity of the child study still existed, in spite of the fact that Rudolf Steiner's methods had been thrown out 20 years ago. That stayed. I found that very interesting. So we've actually rebuilt that in Sunfield, but we've also done research on it, as I've said. Now, what emerged furthermore in this work with UWI and other universities, including Lillehammer, which also gave us an opportunity of putting our method into a master's. And that was particularly successful because the Norwegian government didn't charge for their masters. So, you know, that makes a difference. And so we had another group of staff who also undertook their masters with Lillehammer University in Norway. And what became clear is that we had developed 7 fields of practice in the Ruskin Mill Trust. And that then drew down a name, Practical Skills Therapeutic Education. And whilst this was going on, I have to say the trust doubled in size. And there's a direct link between the growth of the trust, the ability of staff to grow within themselves and with the trust, and the ability to find skills in abundance so that we could, in fact, grow without diluting the method. And I think, you know, when I do a little bit more work on these dynamics in an organization about growth and yet still retaining the integrity of understanding and content, there is a direct link with the necessity to actually have really good quality training. And the masters provided the quality of insights, methods, and reflective processes for leaders, for new leaders to emerge, for teachers to actually become competent, for support workers to become teachers, and even support workers to become principals. So I would say that the method of the trust, once it went into a research forum and became, in a way, congruent with the quality assurances of our current time and could sit in language that was understood, even though it was quite challenging at times, Ruskin Mill flourished. So that's a kind of potted piece of biography and a kind of vignette into the trust. There are lots of interesting challenges along the way. There are, I have interests in how does Rudolf Steiner sit in your national psyche, because there's a lot of work to do there in my view. Ruskin Mill has not had kickback because we're Steiner based in any of the tricky situations over the last few years with Rudolf Steiner schools. All the commissioners know that we're based on Rudolf Steiner's ideas, although they also know that it's a Ruskin Mill brand. And increasingly, the Ruskin Mill brand has been replaced by the PSTE brand. So they're actually directly commissioning the method, not so much Ruskin Mill, which was also interesting to see how the dynamics in commissioning also move in relationship to your research motivation.
A wonderful introduction. Thank you very much. Yeah, a couple of those, just that last point you mentioned, or the second last point rather, that Steiner and the national psyche. I heard someone recently say that they almost wish, or they thought about writing themselves a philosophy of freedom, but out of an English spirit, or rewriting it out of an English spirit rather than this German idealism, which is something else. But
yeah.
So many interesting threads I could follow in there, Aonghus. But I think seeing that, you know, I'm actually right across the road from Ruskin Mill where you are. It's such a beautiful site. The autumn leaves at the moment are incredible, and I was also here in the summer and the late summer, and also I saw the spring happen here too. It's a stunning place, and I thought you mentioned this concept of the genus loci. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that, maybe even in direct relation to the Ruskin Mill site itself here in Nailsworth in Gloucestershire. Yeah, I'd like to hear more about that.
Yeah, okay. So we call that the genus loci, field 1. And every Ruskin Mill project that we inaugurate we undertake a genus loci. And you could say this is to find a new way of meeting place on this fourfold element that I described. And when a place is met with the method of appreciation and phenomenology in its understanding, it gives something that is not necessarily the case unless it's actually been entered into with goodwill. And so how do you get into a place? And in a Goethean method, a place, of course, is not a dead place. It's a living place. And it changes, and it goes through time, and it goes through space. And it has its own dynamic. And when human beings touch it, it has another dynamic. So the spirit of the place is something that artists and poets describe beautifully, have articulation and form and color towards revealing. But if you're an educationalist and you want to enter the place, not so much as an artist or a poet, but as an educationalist, then you have to inform yourself as to, so what is the rock? How does the rock blend itself into the soil to further the whole botanical process? And how does the botanical process support the biological process of animals and insects and so on? And how does that impact on human well-being and creativity and entrepreneurship and initiative? And going through this process, you arrive at an insight which might be called, well, who are you? And that is an amazing statement. Who are you? So that is also controversial because you're endowing the place with a sense of beingness. And if you can get through this process to seeing that the place has a being, then you start to have reciprocity with a co-creative process. So what I was after in the Horsley Valley was, in a way, a handshake with the biography of the place, and this goes back thousands of years, but also with the biography of the students. And can we have this handshake of co-biographic synergy? What does the adolescent need for them to go through their process? What does the biography of the place potentially reveal when we actually know who it is? And so over the years, this reciprocity between the biography of the place and the biography of how the students needed certain aspects of the valley to plant up, for example, with orchards or with willow, or to dig the clay and to make the pots, or to actually shear the sheep, and what kind of grass and what kind of hedges were necessary, you start to see that you can rebuild an entire ecology, not based so much on nature's dynamic, but on the human being's interestedness in potentializing nature through the fact that we can see more. And by bringing biodynamics into that, you then actually form something entirely conscious and new that doesn't exist in nature. Now, this might sound quite controversial at first, but in a way it isn't. In fact, we could say that what Ruskin Mill has done in the Horsley Valley is to make nature unnatural, because it's actually a project of human endeavor, creativity, and consciousness in order to help human beings grow and thrive in the world. And the world that's been created has this porosity with the needs of the young person to be able to grow and thrive. And so there's not a damaging relationship of asking nature to become a kind of consciously created organism, as is a biodynamic farm. Far from it. What happens is that the valley becomes the agency for therapeutic education. And that is something Ruskin Mill has definitely pioneered. It has been drawn from and this is important to recognize this from Margaret Calhoun's work at Pishwanton when she was there, and also Dr. Bochamol's work at the Goetheanum when he was there. So I've synthesized Margaret Calhoun and Dr. Bochamol's work in such a way that it's been put into an educational context, not so much an environmental context, but one in which we can grow human beings. So people come to me and people come to the staff and say, I don't understand why it's so beautiful, this valley. And I say, well, it isn't an accident. It is consciously created in order to generate well-beingness and health for our students, and actually anyone who wishes to walk through the valley. It's also for the general public. So how do we shift an ecology into a conscious created situation so that it can endow therapeutic education? Well, you're going to have to go back to Rudolf Steiner's insights, particularly in the 12 senses. And you're going to have to go, but not back, but into Rudolf Steiner's knowledge of the 7 life processes. And between the 12 senses and the 7 life processes of Rudolf Steiner's work, Ruskin Mill situates the accountability of its design to claim it to be therapeutic. So we cross-reference the fourfoldness back into 2 sets of absolutely foundational qualities that the human being needs to generate, develop, and polish to some extent, which are the 12 senses and the 7 life processes. So if the 12 senses are reached by the ecology of the valley, and the 7 life processes are supported, then children make very, very rapid progress. Now, one of the other things that we've done is to also go back to the more compliance reductive element of education, and we have no hesitation but to take up measurement. So we like measuring things at Ruskin Mill. We like measuring development from the baseline when the child comes into the organization or the young person. We like measuring every 6 months. We like measuring the capacity to be able to think as well as emotionally become stable and have a skill set there, as well as take up initiative and self-entrepreneurship. And not only that, but some of the basic functional elements of assessing educational ability, we also fully endorse. So when an inspection takes place, in spite of the fact that there may not be a lot of classrooms, the progress that the students and the children have made can be exponential. And without that, Ruskin Mill would never have grown or trebled or quadrupled in size, due to the fact that if you don't measure, you can't see whether you're successful, and nor can commissioners, parents, or the students themselves. So if you have a valley that's been generated out of the genus loci, you need to measure the impact of how that works for the primary purpose of what you're being paid for, namely education.
That's really beautiful. And actually, you told me a story when we have met in person just over the road once for lunch. So you told me a couple of stories just to really bring this into the here and now, or into the physical world. You mentioned about you were talking about the attendance rate of children or young people coming to Ruskin Mill. And I think maybe it was a government organization sort of asking you, why is the attendance rate so good? You know, like other schools all over the place can't get the same sort of result. Would you mind telling that story if you know what I'm talking about?
Sure, I do, yeah. So our attendance rates in our schools and colleges are generally very high. And there was a particular instance when, having set up the Grace Garden School in Bristol, and after 1 year of running the school, there is an Ofsted inspection. Ofsted is rigorous. It's very careful with its language. It is full of wise people, as well as, the more expedient, which, will be in every organization. But generally, we welcome Ofsted in Ruskin Mill. And the reason we welcome Ofsted in Ruskin Mill is that it validates our spiritual scientific method and our creative approaches to some very intractable learning problems. And one of the things that you will always be asked for when you open up a new school is, well, have the children come? So the question is, can you supply us with your attendance data? And that was done. And I looked at it and I thought it's a bit high. So I thought, well, I better check it. And I went to talk to a colleague and we both checked it. And we were, in a way, quite challenged by the fact that it was still high. It hadn't dropped. And so I actually asked, I asked for it to be checked again 3 times. So nothing changed. And so the inspector looked at it and said, Mr. Gordon, this is very high. And what's your explanation? You've just opened a school. Many of the profiles of the children, because I've already read quite a lot of your data, show that they are distinctive school refusers. And so to have a 94% attendance rate in the first year is a little bit off the Richter scale. So what is your explanation? And I said, well, I would imagine that it would be to do with the curriculum. And she said, you mean you don't know? And I said, no, I think it's actually to do with the curriculum. So she said, well, maybe I have to assume from this that, that you really don't know. You haven't really checked it out. And I said, well, come back to me. And she said, I will. And so she did 3 days later, and she had a big smile on her face. And she said, well, Mr. Gordon, I have to say your data is correct. But I was disappointed that you couldn't tell me why the children come to school. And so I asked the children myself, why do you come to school? And I got a very interesting answer. And the children told me more or less unanimously that they come to school to feed the animals. And I was delighted with that response. For me, that would have been what I said, which is it will be to do with the curriculum. But she wasn't going to have it. She wanted a more drilled down assessment of why. So what's going on here? You see, it's a very interesting statistic. And what it shows is that the children are able to develop a relationship with a sentient being more easily as an animal than possibly a human being. And there's good reason for that, because their history is one of being let down by adults very, very often, and in certain cases, highly manipulated and often in an abusive relationship. So when they come to school and they want to experience affection and love, they can show that by being absolutely dedicated to the welfare of the animal, which is absolutely natural and correct, and is actually possibly compensating for years of a certain type of emotional neglect. So the steadfastness of the children in their dedication to the welfare of animals enabled them to come to school with joy and attention, which could not be found in any other context. And it went down to the degree I later found out that if they couldn't come to school, they'd text each other and ask another student to go and actually feed the animals on their behalf if they couldn't come to school. Those animals were never let down. And in a way, Ruskin Mill, for many years, has anyway been researching the impact of how do we work with certain personalities of animals in relationship to characterizations of children that sometimes have got stuck within themselves. And so this like for like within the animal persona and the child habit or persona can be worked through by certain very skillful relationships in bringing certain children's qualities in relationship to certain qualities of the animal. And we're doing some very interesting research and work around that. And it would take another talk to go into that, but it is very exhilarating to see the power of how animals can support child and young people's development. I'm not talking about pets. I'm talking about the farm community of animals.
That's fascinating, and I can actually vouch for that to some degree because I actually walk over there at Ruskin Mill every day, pretty much. And there's a young man who I often see walking up and down the path, and there are several herons over there, beautiful big birds. And this young man comes back. I met his mother, and she said she brings him back every week. And why does he come back? He comes back to see the herons, and he actually has a heron T-shirt on every time he comes as well. Big heron on the front and the back.
Yeah. Well, if you look at the persona of the heron, you see all sorts of very interesting traits, and the students will form certain relationships with certain animals because they have a certain character which they admire or adore or want to work through, because it's not necessarily static either or fixated. But that's a whole area of new research we're working on. I mean, the animals that are powerfully therapeutic are the chickens, the sheep, the goats. I would put goats at the top of all animals in relationship to their therapeutic endowment.
Why is that, Angus? Why goats?
So the goat. So just look at the goat. It's got those two horns. It headbutts the shins of the boys and the girls. The shins of the boys and girls, when they're butted gently with the horns and the head of the goats, create enormous laughter and joy, deep stimulation, and they're playful and they're highly interactive. And then you could find at the end of the day, if it's a female goat, that something completely different enters into the relationship with the animal, which is milking the goat. And the change of personality quality that's needed to be in a relationship of being shin butted in the morning and then actually milking the goat in the afternoon is so transformative and so demanding for different attributes of soul quality that the animal is exercising something completely remarkable that only the wisest teacher would be able to do with more neurotypical kids, to be honest with you. So each animal has an endowment of skill and quality, which has to be brought into relationship by the student to the animal in order for it to be effective and helpful. So the goat is probably the most valuable animal in terms of an educational medium. Sheep run away. They're far too ephemeral and cautious. But where they come into their own is through shearing and the ability of also milking the lambs. So there are issues of nurturing very often that have been missed, and bottle feeding the early lambs after lambing can be absolutely transformative for students. Caring for the
sorry, go on.
Caring for the pigs can be again transformative. And if I'm really honest here, we do keep donkeys, even though they're not particularly productive. But the farms at Ruskin Mill aren't based on a production model. They're based on a model of growing human beings, growing the land. So the human beings come before the production of cropping. And so the variety of animals are based on how do the animals best bestow their potential for human development. And the donkeys have a very specific role in that they are often an animal that has been ill-used, abused, and they stand there in complete humility to the transgressions of human beings. And not that actually our students commit any transgressions at all, but their sense of taking the burden in relationship to our relationship with the animal is very, very clear. And so when I see students combing the back of the donkey, the donkey is completely able to submit to the student's goodwill, the affection that the students have, the cleaning of the hoof, and this powerful relationship of acquiescence of quite a large animal in the form of a donkey to the goodwill of a student is, again, transformative. And so something is healed in the student when they can actually offer the degree of affection which donkeys can absorb without being upset or frightened. So they are animals that take the goodwill of the student with unconditional goodwill.
Do you think that what you've developed here or what you've learned from the research could be applied to education in general? I mean, Steiner education, obviously Waldorf schools, because you know they are in trouble, especially in this country, in the UK. And you know, maybe you have some thoughts about that. I mean, could this be applied across the board to education to help children? Because it's almost like education needs to be therapeutic now. I mean, Steiner talked about that education is a therapy in a sense, but could that be more widely applied?
Well, it's salutogenic. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I agree with you. I think we've got stuck in understanding what a school is. And as you know from my early research, I broke out of this conditioning of what a school is. And I broke into a kind of deschooling mode, which I'm not recommending. I was able to do that because I was an absolute committed educationalist, and I would only go so far as I could get good results. But the concept of taking the classroom outdoors would only work if we had a completely new skill, which is, I'm afraid, the one that often is rejected in Steiner education, which is how do we assess and measure? And if you can assess and measure in the right way, then the progression of the child, and the child needs to know this themselves too. So this is both for the child, the parent, but also the school itself. So there are three parties involved here. And if you're going to externalize learning, then you have to find new ways in which to assess. And you need to have a whole new training process as well for education. So Ruskin Mill can do this because it's absolutely relentless on training. I mean, we put 5% of our turnover every year into training, and that's millions. And it pays a dividend straight away. In fact, I know that we wouldn't be here had we not started 15 years ago already investing heavily in staff training. And I said earlier that this has also led to the growth of the organization. So the Steiner schools could, and I've done some work in the past, externalize their learning basis to working at a deeper level with nature, provided you can show that what you're innovating is working. So if you don't research, you won't be able to do it. And I think that is where, in part, the schools have got stuck, is that there isn't the finance to really set up proper research. How does Ruskin Mill take this out? Well, we have a lot of demands for consultancies worldwide, actually. And the issue is, how do you create new contexts and how do you translate? And that is a whole new piece of educational thinking and research, which Ruskin Mill simply does not have the time to be able to do. But we're on the cusp of enabling somebody with the right resources to come along and actually do a further piece of translation. Interestingly enough,
sorry, Angus, can I just ask what you mean? Sorry to interrupt. I just want to ask what you mean by translation. I didn't quite catch what you meant.
So translation is, how do you translate what is effective at Ruskin Mill into either a Waldorf school or a state-funded school where you've got 20 children? Because we have 5 in a group. And so this ability to take something that is working on a small scale into a scaling up process is a very skillful process, and it would have to be researched very well. And that isn't something that we can do. But we are in a position to support any initiative. And in fact, I have sponsored a PhD where the question is, how do we take the Ruskin Mill method into mainstream? So I'm concerned that some of the insights from Ruskin Mill are also offered into regular education. But I also know that it's a paradigm shift, just like we took a paradigm shift from more regular education into creating classrooms in nature. So it's a translation process of being able to scale up, use the language, and understand the dynamics of small and medium to large groups.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thanks for that clarification.
So yeah, I mean, it's the job that needs to be done, and I'm very passionate about the fact that it should be done.
Can I ask you about maybe just one more point before we finish up today? And that is, you're obviously a very entrepreneurial person. I understand from our conversations that you have had pushback on things that you've been trying to do, maybe to do with the land itself, or, when it, forgive me for saying, but if a strong personality comes along and has something they want to do, there's going to be things and people that get in the way or whatever. But what really has shone through for me in our meeting when we met before and also today is actually your love and care and compassion for the students and the land, and that's I think you said yourself, that's your number one priority, and then everything else is sort of built around that. So I admire that very much. But what I want to ask about is this drive and this entrepreneurial activity that often in anthroposophy, or people working in out of Steiner's ideas, are not able to make real in the world. And what you've been able to do is to really, I know it's not in the mainstream, but you've met the mainstream. You've obviously garnered funds and government support and things like that. How have you done that, and why aren't more anthroposophical initiatives able to do that? Just questions around that I have.
So it's tricky to answer that. So I use the word spiritual science regularly, and I see it as a skill. And so I turn what might be considered an insight or a philosophy into a skill. And I'm interested in conveying skills to people. And, in a way, at the heart of the philosophy of freedom is the ability to become skillful within oneself, to take oneself in hand, and in doing so, help the world. So if you actually look at another aspect of the philosophy of Ruskin Mill, the craft product is a very important item, both to get there, but also for it to be of value to others. So the self has to be in a relationship to the social imperative, which is actually, I don't do this for myself, I do it for my colleagues and the world at large. And when you put that as your primary objective, then this translation from spiritual science into skills of capacity to gain one's own individual autonomy and purpose and task, and for it to become clear, and then to endow those and then to take those skills and endowment and task into the world so that others benefit, is in a way my summary of why I do what I do. Now, I'm very passionate about Steiner, actually, and I feel very committed to making sure that Steiner's gifts are actually researched and not owned individually, but are actually for the distribution into further skill development in the world. And so my entrepreneurship is partly motivated to do outreach with a set of tools that are incredibly effective and transform. And so my motivation comes to that. Now, why are others not maybe so motivated? Well, I think they can. I have some colleagues who are trapped in the philosophy as opposed to the skill of what's endowed by practicing spiritual science, put it that way. And therefore, if you don't go out and have things checked and in a way subject to rigor, you can fall back into a comfort zone of self-projection. And I'm going to say something challenging here. One of the interesting things about Ruskin Mill's growth is that it has been in part on the gifts of failed anthroposophic initiatives in which this self-rigor did not come to the fore. And what often happens is that buildings are sold, or there's a kind of self-expectation that you have a kind of righteousness to spend the money, because that's actually what spiritual science should be doing, providing courses for the public, but the public don't turn up. And then there's no money. And then I get a phone call. And this has happened probably on half a dozen times. And so my analysis is not a good one, really, for the society at large, because it does show a certain degree of complacency. But the complacency is now becoming more common, because I don't think, and Steiner said it himself, that the power of spiritual science will dwindle unless it's researched. And we've now got the third or fourth generation of people working with spiritual science, and it certainly started to flicker by the third generation, sometimes the second generation. And I'm interested in this flickering of spiritual science if it's not researched. And so my challenge would be, find the research modality that is best suited for spiritual science, which in my view is collaborative action research. It's already practiced, but it's not understood to be such a wonderful tool as it is, and go from projection and opinion to insight. And when you move from opinion into insight, something happens.
Very interesting. Steiner himself, in a sense, you could say, I think, was much more interested in the method itself rather than just the knowledge, if you like.
Yeah.
So one way to put that is that
That's nice.
he's often read, and I'm guilty of this myself. We read him for the knowledge, for these concepts and ideas, but actually, I think it was Christopher Bamford wrote in one of the introductions that actually almost everything he said, or maybe two-thirds of what he said, could be content for meditation, and not just as facts, like scientific facts, but so methodology is actually where it's at. and as you say, then research, because it is, as we say, spiritual science.
So it's got to translate into skill. And what the world, I mean, what's important in England is, you know, people ask me, well, does it work, Angus? It's, you know, and you know, I'm not asked, is it a good idea? Yeah, nobody's really interested in the idea. Does it work? Is it, in a way, it's a very scientific response. Show me that it works. And how do you do that? Well, you need data. And you know, England's a country of science, and if you work with even the most rudiment scientific principles, like collecting information and collecting you know, results, people actually like you. And the growth of Ruskin Mill is entirely based on getting results. It's a very result-based organization, and it's, you know, it does have a kind of production line as well, you know, and we have more applicants than we could ever work with. In our new school on the campus of Emerson, Ashdown Garden School, we're getting 20 inquiries a day. 20. And we can only start with 20, and this has been going on for months. And the crisis in education is so much more severe than the public are led to believe. Because when you set up a special school, you begin to see the underbelly of the significant neglect that England is turning its back on. And how does it turn its back on is really a shocking situation. So find a method, check it, develop skills, and solve a problem in the world. And the other thing that Ruskin Mill does is to ask the question, not what I want to do, but what does the world require? And so part of the entrepreneurial spirit is to ask, so what does it require? And we will do what's required, not always what we want to do. And that actually is quite a challenging situation, because very often people only do what they want to do. And then they don't always know why. Maybe they don't make a proper living, or they haven't grown, or people aren't really interested in what they've got to offer. So the thing about spiritual science is that it can be applied to any single detail. There is nothing it can't be applied to. And so if you put it into what the world requires, then you have spiritual science working into the bedrock of the kind of national psyche and the constitution.
Wonderful. That's a great way to put it. And I think that, you know, with Steiner's path or paths of spirituality, it's so much about drawing down the spirit, if you like, or spiritualizing ourselves and spiritualizing the earth, bringing the spirit to the earth, rather than a kind of an escape from the earth, which some spiritual
Yeah,
paths can lead to. But
yeah.
I think, Angus, that's probably a good place for us to finish. I would love to have another conversation in the future if you have the time and would be
Okay.
interested.
Yeah,
But I just want to
great.
say thank you very much for joining me today. And is there
Yeah.
any, would you like me to put any links down below for the video for people to discover more about your work? I know you have a
I will
book.
get my, yeah, I will ask Anna to send you all the requisite links where people can find out about the practitioner's guide and the new book that's just been written on Ruskin Mill.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, Angus, well,
Great.
yeah, thank you very much once again.
I was
I
delighted. Thank you,
look
and
forward to speaking
all
to
the
you again.
best. And it was
Same
a
to you.
good conversation. Yeah, great. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Angus. Bye-bye. Bye for now.